One of my favorite things about competitive Pokemon is just how applicable its teachings can be in real life. Whether that's the strategy derived from the game itself, because it teaches you how to think critically, be creative, stuff like that, or from the community surrounding it, and how these two often interact. But in terms of the community, I mean, let me tell you, once you've dealt with smog and tearing politics and the wrath of the Smogtor's lobby during a tournament game, then there's nothing you can't take in real life. It's a blessing. So one example of such philosophizing is the ultimate debate about democracy, in which I have ranted about how much I hate Gen 5 OU and how there shouldn't be, democratic input because the people who give their opinions on Gen 5 OU generally don't know what they're talking about. And then you can see how that can transfer to real life. Now, I don't have a real life parallel off the top of my head for what we're talking about here, but I think it's more about, if I think about it for 2 seconds, because I can't think about my videos before I start them. That would be ridiculous. It's more about the principle versus the practicality of it. And I absolutely love the furious debate and drama this kind of thing sparks. So what is our example here? Okay, we'll just look at the first turn of this game. First we look at turn 0. T-Tar versus Salamence, okay? You don't have to be a Gen 3 expert to assume both of these can probably mess each other up in some way, right? And then what happens? The Mence does a lot with Hidden Power Flying, because that's its stab in Gen 3, which shows that it's Choice Banded. And with a Choice Band attached, then Brick Break will KO any T-Tar. But the T-Tar stays in, even though it knows it can die to CB Brick Break, and it stays in and Ice Beams, and the Mence dies on the first turn. So that was a very simplified version of what happens here. But what we were talking about is the lead matchup between Salamence and Tyranitar in advance. Because, so first we have to get into the details of each side, right? So sets Salamence is going to run in the lead slot are pretty much limited to Choice Band and Mixed. So Choice Band is HP Flying, EQ, Rock Slide, Brick Break. And Mixed also runs Brick Break, but it will not KO even a 0 bulk T-Tar. So that's important. And yeah, sometimes you will see like a DD Mence, in the lead slot to throw people off. But for our purposes here, it's the same as Mixed, because it's banded and it can KO T-Tar in one move, or it's not banded and it cannot. But it's not as simple as is this Mence banded or not. It also depends on the T-Tar set, because T-Tar runs all sorts of sets in the lead slot. It can run its Pursuit set, which might have Ice Beam. It can run a mixed set, the UD-Tar, named after UD. And that is Ice Beam, Fire Blast, Brick Break, HP Grass. That obviously can KO Mence in one shot. And then it can run a bunch of sets with Rock Slide. Dragon Dance, 4 attacks, and sub, feasibly. Some sort of mixed set with Rock Slide, right? Like Rock Slide, Focus Punch, Fire Blast, HP Grass. That's a good one. But it will never actually KO Mence with Rock Slide because of -1 unless it's Choice Band. So, you see how it's not just about the Mence, but it's also about the Tar. And, what else was I going to get to? I know there are people out there like, why is this video taking so long? This video is an antidote to the fast-paced internet of today, where everything has to be right away. And I am encouraging you to take it easy, stretch your arms like I'm doing right now, and to relax. I actually just massaged my head a little bit, and I made myself yawn. Good lord, I am taking it easy right now. Anyway, so let's ease back into our zen little philosophizing on T-Tar versus Mence. So I often wonder what the Zen Buddhists would say about this matchup. So It's about the T-Tar versus Mence matchup, of course, but it's also about what both players have aside from that match, aside from their lead. How do they respond to whatever Pokemon? And here's where the debate comes in. Now, I have somewhat of a reputation as believing really, really firmly that T-Tar should always switch out of Salamence. And if you would like proof, then note this game from SP. Also, all the games we're looking at today are from this most recent SPL, so they are the most recent high level of tournament play. So, T-Tar, McMegan switches out to Zapdos on a CB Brick Break. Look at that. That could have happened there. So, and then Triangle switches out, and if we looked at the battle chat, then Triangle says BKC is pleased. Yeah, that's I've been debating this for years. Sometimes a little too passionately. So, the idea of CB Mence potentially KOing T-Tar on the first turn is always not going to be the case, of course. Like, yes, a lot of time Mence is not going to be CB in the lead slot because it's a lot harder to fit. When you run Mixed Mence, you can run that on so many different teams because it's very self-sufficient. Whereas with CB, you really, really need that anti-Skarmory support. 99% of the time it's Magneton, but I and a couple other players have recently substituted Hariyama over Magneton because Hariyama is amazing. Still have to make that Hariyama video. And yeah, that means that you are a lot more limited in what you're going to, in the amount of time, or the number of times you're going to face a CB Mence lead. However, my reasoning for not liking the CB Mence, or the T-Tar staying in on Mence thing, is as follows. I believe in advance, you do not need to cut corners in order to cover the threats of the metagame. That's why it's a good metagame. It's very stable. And you can just play the game. And a lot of my Pokemon philosophy revolves around, tiering and in battle alike, is revolving around letting players play the game, have interaction. And that's how you demonstrate your skill. And that's what should be rewarded. Or at least, be seen as significant by the player base. Because, the player base tends to define the view of a player a lot more than their achievements do. Which sometimes can be unfortunate, because, you see some great players being overlooked because of silly social reasons. Like, I have a video on CL, which demonstrates that exactly. And there, again, is another real-life lesson from the world of Pokemon. But we're getting sidetracked. Shocker. So, the reason is, Advance, you don't have to go out of your way to, if you have a good team, to counter the Pokemon in the metagame, right? And this means that at the beginning of a game, you should be able to answer whatever reasonably. Because if you can't answer a Pokemon on turn 1, then you're probably not going to be doing too great against it in general. Yes, there are some exceptions, like, for example, Offensive Suicune gets a lot harder to deal with if you are, once you have Sand and Spikes up, as opposed to just, right from the beginning when you have Sand up at most. But that's something you have to take into account with your team. And if I generally am not a big believer in cutting corners with your team and then having to take dumb risks like that in game. And I think they're dumb risks because to me, there is nothing stupider. There's no worse feeling than being completely helpless against a standard threat because either your team couldn't handle it or because you made some super risky move that was not necessary. Like, for example, in this game, we'll get into the details of this game in particular, but in general, if the T-Tar dies to Mence on turn 1 and you just feel like a complete idiot, I don't know. I really, really despise that because I've seen a lot of players argue, and this is where the debate is going to spark, is that, oh, well, I need to make risky plays like this to get an edge over my opponent I'm not favored against. It's like, yeah, there's levels of risk in every play, of course. Even playing it safe can, be its own form of risk. Often is, actually. It's very exploitable. But what I'm referring to is making moves that are unnecessary. It's about bad positioning. It's not about, because to me the game is not about, getting in your opponent's head and reading their soul as much as positioning your board a lot better than, or as well as you can. I mean, you're going to have to make plays according to how your opponent is playing at certain points, of course, but like risking things like this because there's not enough information. Now, this leads to another debate, which is, oh, well, I know my opponent tends to use mixed ments a lot more, or I know my opponent loves CB ments, and that affects your decision somehow. Now, this is another entirely different video I have to make about the whole notion of prep. I'm not against the idea inherently, but I think there's a lot of issues in the way people approach it. So, because I've seen this happen so many times. Oh yeah, my opponent always brings, let's say just mixed ments in this scenario, because this happens in every tier. Oh, my opponent always brings mixed ments, so I'll never stay in. My opponent always brings mixed ments, so I will always stay in with T-Tar. And by that same logic, I've also seen people say, my opponent always brings mixed ments, and they know I'm aware of this, so if they lead ments, it's going to be CB, and I'm going to switch. Neither of those are based in anything that you can control either way. You are leaving it up to your opponent a lot more than anything of your own volition. And I really don't like that. I really don't like throwing up the prayer sign right off the bat. On turn 1, like later in the game, yes, okay, sometimes you will have no choice. It's like, well, I have to hope that T-Tar's, I have to play as if that T-Tar doesn't have HP grass, because if it does, I lose anyway, right? That's something else. But on the first turn, it just doesn't feel necessary. So, that whole, I know my opponent loves to use CB ments and double switch on the first turn, so I'm going to stay in and use pursuit, or stuff like that is not as grounded in, or is not very grounded in anything you can consistently rely on. What you can more consistently rely on, and this I have some sympathy for, is the way the ments user should play. But even then, the ments user can just fire this right back at you, depending on their team. Because the T-Tar user can say, alright, well, if the ments player knows that I will never switch out with T-Tar, then they will go for Brick Break, and therefore I will switch out. And just making yourself unpredictable. But then you're getting into guessing game territory, and that's what I don't like. You cannot control a guessing game nearly as well. And as you can tell, I'm a bit of a control freak. And before you say, oh, well, you can't be such a control freak, a lot of the most consistent players, if you just care about having fun, then, this video is pretty irrelevant to you anyway. But if you want to win consistently and reliably, then being a control freak is kind of a good way of going about it. Like, it's the whole consistent balance versus risky offense thing. I've had debates with this with Vapicuno, a very prominent figure in the advanced community. And he says, yeah, when you're playing someone who you're favored against, or who you don't worry about, playing circles around you, you just bring balance because it's low variance. And with offense, it's high variance. And high variance means that you are often just as in the dark or out of control as your opponent is. You're just hoping that you're just giving yourself a greater chance that that shot in the dark will land for you because it's unexpected. So, props to McMegan, by the way, who switched his T-Tar out of Salamence on turn 1 and dodged a CB Brick Break twice this SPL. This is why he's the greatest of all time. And of course, Altina also switched his T-Tar out of this lead CB meant, or I don't know if this, I don't remember if this meant was CB. Yeah, so this was a case of the double switch on Mentz's end. So if Mentz, this goes to the other Mentz versus T-Tar thing, which is where, yes, I know that T-Tar is afraid of me being CB, so it's going to switch. Therefore, I will not use Brick Break. You know, if you're a choice banner, you can use HP Flying, which I think is bad, by the way. Or I'll use Rock Slide, because Zapdos is actually a very popular interim switch, and it hits Skarmory just as hard as Brick Break. So Rock Slide is good. And if you're a mixed set, and you're just scaring it out with the threat of CB, then it's very common to see Fire Blast go off there, HP Grass, you know, Dragon Claw. Any of those can have a reasonable argument made for them. So, yeah, you're saying T-Tar is going to run for me because of the threat of because of the threat of CB Brick Break. Therefore, I will not actually use Brick Break, because even if you're mixed, there's also the option of not attacking at all and just double switching, whether you're CB or mixed. You know, with CB, I like to go to Magneton on the first turn, because if there's a Scarm, it's very likely coming in. That's a huge advantage right off the bat. And if you're mixed, like you can do what Sadly just did and go to your Scarm and get up spikes on like a Swampert or something. But then there's also, you know, what if the T-Tar stays in? Because as we established earlier, the only way it's KOing Ment's back on the first turn anyway, you know, feasibly it could DD. Very unlikely. That seems like a big waste, but, you know, feasibly. Because it's at neutral attack and +1 speed against a full health team. Great. So the only way it's actually KOing T-Tar back is with Ice Beam or CB Rock Slide. So with the Mentz user, you can take that into your calculation as well and say, all right, well, even if the T-Tar does stay in, then you can... then it's only going to beat me if it has Ice Beam or, you know, CB Rock Slide. And based on my opponent, that's unlikely. But again, I don't like that whole based on my opponent thing, because I've seen so many people swear and point to the data and go, based on this and this and this, there's no way they would ever do that. And then that exact thing they counted on not facing is exactly what they face. So there is realistically no difference, because my opponent will do this because they always do this, and my opponent will do this because they never do this, and I'm aware of it. Again, shots in the dark, can't control it, hate it, hate it, hate it. Yeah, then there's the T-Tar thing, which can function similarly, and that's the idea that, oh, well, the Mentz should switch out because CB doesn't want to attack on the first turn, and because if you Brick Break into Skarm or Gengar or whatever, then you've took 6% on your CB Mentz, and it's not necessary yet when you could just double switch. Therefore, even though I'm a T-Tar without Ice Beam, I'm gonna, you know, stay in with my Pursuit Tar and use Pursuit or whatever. That was something that was actually said the other day, and I kind of get it, but at the same time, that whole idea where you say, oh, well, the Mentz user should or shouldn't do this because the T-Tar could be Ice Beam, or the T-Tar user is going to switch out. You know, the whole point is that it almost doesn't matter, because you don't know what's in your opponent's head at that time. You don't know how they think of the game. Even if you think you know how they think, because you've known them for a couple years or whatever, you don't know if they're going to stick to it, or if they're going to switch it up just for you. You know, and putting such a game-changing gamble into effect on the first turn in a metagame as balanced as Advance, where one of its best features is that you don't have to take such insane risks, it's not my preferred type of gameplay. Let's just say that, because again, part of being consistent in Pokemon is not getting caught up in the minutia of he will predict here, they will predict here, they won't do it, they will, based on stuff that you can't control. Because and this is an extension of that whole video I have about prediction is overrated and positioning is more important, because if I have, let's say, let's take a more modern gen example. If I have a Gliscor that hard counters specially defensive Heatran, right? This counts from gens 5 to 7. And there is nothing my opponent can do to punish me from switching to Gliscor on Heatran. There's absolutely nothing. Whatever they do, I've got 16 answers for, right? Then why wouldn't I go to Gliscor on Heatran every time? Because you can control that. You can make sure no matter what happens on that turn, you will not be getting messed up by Heatran, no matter how predictable it is or not. So as soon as you introduce uncertainty and guesswork, then you wind up undermining your own ability to just play the game and be in control. Because you have to control what you can as much as you can, and for that you need information and just generally solid play. And as soon as you start throwing it up in the air and going, well, I hope I don't potentially lose the game on the first turn in very avoidable circumstances. Now, with sympathy to this game, then it was explained after, because this whole turn one sparked insane debate. First of all, I think HP flying with CB Ments is bad against T-Tar, because the best thing you're going to hit there is a water who's not going to take it much better than EQ anyway. If you really feel like you have to hit the water in the first turn with CB Ments, go with EQ, because at least there you're slamming T-Tar really hard. And in fact, KOing most of those offensive sets, like the mixed set with Ice Beam, which is one of the few that actually threatens you, then you can KO that with CBEQ, because that drops. It doesn't run any bulk. And you will hit the water effectively as hard. It's a base power difference of 5. So you don't need the HP flying there. And if you're going to predict the T-Tar switching out like fully, then Rock Slide or Switch. So the logic here behind T-Tar switching in was that CB Ments is not as difficult for the team to deal with. Well, actually, that's the whole thing, and why it sparked debate, because I disagree with it. But the basic idea was that if we look at the rest of the team, then Mix Ments is difficult to deal with. Oh, I guess we only saw 3 Pokemon. But the other Pokemon were Celebi, Swampert, and Metagross, right? But I don't know. I mean, I understand that it's a calculated risk, and it's the whole I can't switch into Mix Ments very well thing. I don't know. I know Mix Ments is tough to switch around, but at the same time, if it's that difficult to deal with I don't know. This is it's like when people really take big gambles on like Suicune leads or Zapdos leads or whatever. There are similar debates about Skarm versus Zapdos leads, where Skarm was like, oh yeah, I could lose the game on the first turn when I really don't need to, but I feel like getting spikes because no way Zapdos is modest and runs and uses Thunderbolt and gets the roll or crits or Parafull Paras. It's such an unnecessary risk, and that's really what this whole thing is about. Now, I understand in tournament games, if you always, and we will get back to this, don't worry, I haven't forgotten it, but if you always do the same move, then yes, sometimes you're going to want to switch it up. But at the same time, I think a balance can be found where you can switch it up without risking, losing to someone for very avoidable reasons. It's, I think if I were in the position of, my T-Tar versus Ments, and I always switch out my T-Tar against Ments, so this time I'm going to stay in, and then I was playing someone good like McMegan who brings a CB Ments and uses Brick Break, and then I would feel like the stupidest person ever. It's like, did I need to take that gamble? If I was so set on staying in like that, then I don't know, I might even reconsider leading T-Tar in general if I'm so terrified of Ments. I don't know, it's a bigger debate. I realize it's hard to cover something like Mixed Ments. It's a very difficult Pokemon to answer. But I don't know, I guess and that's why team building is hard. But yeah, here, look what happens if the Ments dies, because Laurel was actually using a team of mine, and then I was upset that it looked bad. Because, look, there's a Skarm in here, right? And it comes in, and it gets Magnetoned. So, if the T-Tar dies, then and for nothing. And then Scarm comes in, gets spikes. Magneton comes in, gets a KO. Laurel is up 6-4. Now, the idea that Frudazi had was that he has a Mixments of his own, and that is threatening with a layer of spikes down. But, I mean, then we see here it doesn't even get past Blissey initially, and there goes the initial... Yeah, it can work, but I don't know. I thought this was going to be a different team of mine with Claydol and Suicune, and it wound up being the one with Skarmory and Moltres, which is still fine. But switching Blissey right in, or Metagross right in, when you know... Well, I guess this is more an example of Laurel being inexperienced in advance. But, yeah, the game itself is not really important. Now, imagine this matchup, 6-4 down, and it's more a pick your poison of... Oh, well, I'm willing to be 6-4 down in the opening turns against CB Men's teams because I'd rather deal with Mixments on turn 1, which I guess, but I don't know. If Mixments is that terrifying, it's not like Suicune where you can slow it down with Sand and Spikes. What happens when it comes in later with free attacks? If you can't switch in... Yeah, so... I personally think that he can pivot around Mixments fairly decently. Depending on the sets, if you tweak it for it and just play well, of course. But if the risk is there on turn 1, imagine how bad it's going to be when it comes in later, especially potentially with a layer of spikes on its own. So that makes pivoting around it even harder. Like, at that point, it's less about the turn 1 and more about the Ments itself. And I guess that extends to the philosophy of the turn 1 thing. It's like, look, not everything is as manageable on later in the game as it is on turn 1. Yeah, so I think I've basically said everything I want to say. I just feel very strongly about this, but more than the specific example of the CB Ments versus the T-Tar, or the non-CB Ments versus the T-Tar, then think about the principles and ideals versus practicality of it. Because a lot of the time there is not, and this is the final Pokemon life lesson, a lot of the time there is not one simple, easy, correct answer. It's very rarely objective. There's so much nuance into it. I personally hate, T-Tar staying in on Ments, but I understand that, there are more elements to it than just, T-Tar should never stay in. You have to not just take the wisdom, but understand it, why it's coming from, or where it's coming from, and if need be, question it. So that's how we move forward, that's how we learn, and yeah. So thank you so much for watching. I hope this was informative and enjoyable and useful for you, and I will catch you in the next one.